Hello friends, my name is JJ. So the other day I was watching a Let's Play of the 1992 Super Nintendo hit classic Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, as one does. And eventually the guy got up to the final boss, the Dark King. And when I saw him I was like, oh man, they really phoned in the character design with this one. I mean, this is the most generic looking king I've ever seen. And then I got to thinking, hey, who even came up with this idea of what a king is supposed to look like anyway? I mean, we all recognize this look as a king, even though it bears very little resemblance to how kings look in the real world, which is basically just some old white man in a business suit, or Arab clothes, I guess. But of course, a king who looks like this usually isn't supposed to represent a king in the literal sense of a political ruler, but rather just some more abstract idea of a king as like the grand and exalted leader of something. Be he the king of hearts, the king of all cosmos, or the king of floors.
I buy factory direct. You save.
And like any good stereotype, this cliched notion of a king has a certain stable visual iconography associated with it. And that is what we will be deconstructing today as part of the latest installment in my award-winning series, Why Does This Thing Look Like That? So, your standard stereotypical cartoon type depiction of a king is comprised of the following four pieces: crown, robe, scepter, and facial hair. You look at any lazy depiction of a king in any piece of contemporary media across most of the world, be it an illustration in a kid's book, an actor in a costume, or a character in a video game, and chances are high his kingship will be communicated by the presence of these four things. So, let us start with perhaps the most stereotypical king thing of all, the king's crown, or, as our Spanish-speaking amigos call it, a corona, which is actually the original Latin word as well. It means ring of leaves, which we may recall is what the Roman emperors used to put on their heads back in the day. This, in turn, is something that originated from a story in Greek mythology in which the horny god Apollo was pursuing a woman, only for her to be changed into a laurel tree. And then Apollo says,
"Fairest of maidens, you are lost to me, but at least you shall be my tree. With your leaves my victors shall wreathe their brows."
And thus, the Romans took Apollo's lead and put wreaths on the head of anyone important, including Olympic athletes, beloved actors, and their emperors. Over the centuries, as the Roman Empire got more pompous and decadent, their emperor's headwear got increasingly grand and gaudy, reflecting their increasingly inflated views of themselves. Eventually their head leaves were made out of gold, and then they stuck in jewels and other junk, and they would sometimes even have these giant gold spikes sticking out of the top, supposedly to capture the idea of rays of light emanating from the god emperor's divine skull. In the 4th century, the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, which then changed the official narrative of where the emperors got their power from. They went from holding the throne by virtue of their own godly status to holding the throne based on the will of their new one very specific Christian god, which in turn justified Christianing up all of the symbols of the emperor, including the head thing, which going forward would now often be topped with a single Christian cross. And the placing of this crown on the head of the emperor by some Christian holy man became one of the most important traditions of this new Christian system of government, a tradition known as a coronation. Get it? So if you go looking for some crown clip art today, you will probably either get a spiky looking thing like this, or a closed hat looking thing like this. The hat type crowns would eventually become the standard look across the Christian monarchies of Western Europe that popped up in the aftermath of the fall of Rome, and in some cases lasted into the early 20th century or beyond. Of the few European monarchies that remain today, however, none still do the whole coronation tradition anymore, in part because it is seen as being too religious and too anti-democratic. Kings now usually just swear an oath of allegiance to the Constitution and people, like a politician, and the crown is just off in some museum somewhere. The only exception is Great Britain, where the late Queen Elizabeth was given an explicitly religious coronation, crown and all, back in 1953. King Charles hasn't had a coronation yet, and it remains to be seen if he will scale back any of the traditions when he does, as he has long been rumored to want. Anyway, the hat-style crowns of Europe, with the little golden arches and fabric bonnet and all of that, are probably inspired by the design of this number, the crown of the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. This was a regime established by Charlemagne in the year 800, and as the name suggests, was quite explicitly intended to be the successor state of the previous Roman Empire. What you are seeing here is actually the oldest surviving crown in all of Europe, and is believed to have been made sometime in the 10th century. Today you can go and see it in the Imperial Treasury Museum in Austria. Now, the spiky style crown, as I mentioned, is a cliche that originates from the ancient Romans, but as far as stereotypes go, this one has survived for a surprisingly long period of time, given that, as far as I've been able to tell, basically no European kings wore crowns of this style during any period that could be broadly called modern, which is to say, like, the Middle Ages onward. But that said, we don't really have a lot of great evidence of this one way or another, because there just aren't that many surviving crowns from the Middle Ages, nor are there very many good contemporary portraits of what the kings of that time actually looked like, because no one was a very good artist back then. The art that we do have suggests that the crowns were closer to this kind of look. Around the 16th century or so, however, people got better at painting and more interested in history, and artists started to make portraits of what they thought the kings of the Middle Ages probably looked like, and a lot of these guys are depicted with spiky crowns. And since you tend to see these paintings in textbooks and things a lot, and because a lot of people don't really have a good grasp of the concept that not all old paintings of a person were necessarily made during that person's lifetime, or even necessarily an accurate representation of what they looked like, the idea of the old-fashioned spiky-crowned king became pretty mainstream in the popular imagination. All right, now let us talk about the king's robe. Robes are basically the oldest form of clothing we have, and have been worn in some form by basically all cultures since the beginning of time. And likewise, in most cultures, the status of a person was often indicated by the fanciness of their robe. The Gospels even describe them putting a robe on Jesus, along with a crown of thorns, to mock him as the King of the Jews before they crucified him. This particular style of fancy robe, made of colored silk lined with white fur with little black bits in it, has been around in Europe for at least 700 years. In the 14th century, it was said to have been made the traditional coronation outfit of the English monarch by King Richard II, as you can see here in this portrait of him that was actually painted during his lifetime. Most other royal families of Europe made their kings and queens wear coronation robes of a similar style, though I believe it is only the monarchs of England and Holland who still rock this look today. So the fur on these types of robes is pretty distinctive, because of course it has these little black bits in it. A lot of European crowns use this type of fur for their bottom lining as well. So what's the deal with it? Well, this is ermine fur, with an ermine being a type of weasel-looking creature that's fairly common in Northern Europe and America. Because they have these beautiful pure white coats, for many centuries they were one of the leading sources of naturally white fur for Europe's fashion scene. And just to prove to everyone that they were using actual ermine fur, as opposed to dog fur or whatever, robe makers would always be sure to include the little black bit from the end of the creature's tail. Sometimes they would even include the whole tail, as you can see here. Having a lot of black bits in the fur lining of your robe or whatever would also signal that a lot of ermine had to die to make it, since every bit basically represented one dead weasel. And in those rather less compassionate times, if your outfit had a high animal body count, that was also considered a real sign that you were something special. All right, now why is the silky part of the robe always purple? Well, I think that most of us know that purple is supposed to be the royal color, and for this, we can once again thank our old pals, the Romans. For most of human history, colored cloth, as opposed to just cloth-colored cloth, was considered a real luxury because it involved dye, and dye was usually made of weird minerals or plants or bug guts or other rare and expensive things that common people couldn't get. In Roman times, purple dye was made from the blood of a certain kind of sea snail, which, much like ermine, had to be killed in extremely large numbers in order to make enough purple cloth to cover an ample royal backside. Purple cloth was so elite, in fact, that some of the more jealous Roman emperors even banned anyone but themselves from wearing it. Now, this is all well and good as far as origin stories go, but looking back at various portraits of past European monarchs in their coronation robes, I couldn't actually find much proof that they were ever that into purple. Red was a lot more common as a robe color, so was blue, even yellow in some cases. Even old man Napoleon, who had a pretty big crush on ancient Rome, just had a red robe. It wasn't until I got to George VI, the father of the late Queen Elizabeth and King of England in the 1940s, that I was able to find pictures of a king wearing purple. I had a bit of a Mandela effect moment as well, because I thought for sure that the fabric parts of those crowns we looked at earlier were purple at least, but no, they're almost always red too. Now, I'm not saying that some of you in the comments won't be able to find me an old portrait of some king somewhere wearing a purple robe. I'm sure it has happened, but it does seem to me that when we have a whole color stereotypically associated with a whole rather narrow class of people, I don't know, that color should probably feature a bit more prominently in their wardrobe. So where does the royal purple cliche come from then? Well, it might just be a British thing. Contrary to what I just said, unlike most other crowns, the fabric in the crown of the British monarch is purple, though it seems like this might be a relatively recent color change, since before Queen Victoria it is usually depicted as being red. But part of me is wondering if it's all just some marketing gimmick from big color. I know that market research generally shows purple to be one of the public's least liked colors, the color least wanted for clothing and cars and paint and so on. So my personal conspiracy theory is probably that at some point, some company with a lot of purple stuff to sell came up with the idea that actually, purple is the royal color. So how do you like it now? All right, now when we think of what a stereotypical king holds in his hand, it is usually some sort of golden stick type thing, which is formally called a scepter. This is yet another relic of ancient Rome. Even in the days before the empire, top politicians in the Roman Republic would often carry ceremonial sticks to indicate their importance, with the emperors just making their sticks bigger and grander with time, just like they did with the head leaves. In 2007, archaeologists in Italy uncovered the only preserved scepter topper of a Roman emperor that has been found to date. And as you can see, it is more or less akin to the sort of thing that the various monarchs of Europe would proceed to make for themselves in later eras. People have speculated about what, if anything, this ancient tradition of stick-holding monarchs is supposed to represent. And it seems like a lot of the conclusions are just that it is something very innate and primal. This stick was man's first weapon, and obviously a lot of more modern weapons are stick-based as well. So the idea would be that a scepter is just some kind of ultra-stylized representation of some vague human concept of being strong and mighty. I mean, there's just something about holding a stick that gives the holder an instant sense of power, as any kid playing in the woods will tell you. And lastly, let us talk about the facial hair. This is, I think, a somewhat underrated symbol of kingliness, just because it's not based on any fancy prop. But still, just think about how rare it is to see any stereotypical depiction of a king without a beard, or at least a mustache. He would look naked. This cultural expectation is probably just another way of evoking the idea of a king as something pretty old-fashioned or from another era. So our current Western ideal that a man should be completely clean-shaven in order to look well-groomed and professional is a concept that tends to fall in and out of fashion over the centuries. We have been living in a clean-shaven era for about 100 years or so, but in the century before that, beards and mustaches were obviously all the rage, which was in turn preceded by another clean-shaven era. The last high watermark of European monarchy was in the late 19th century, and I think it is probably not insignificant that this also happened to be our last recent facial hair era. Because kings, in theory, rule until death, a lot of bearded kings from the late 19th century ruled well into the 20th century, at which point their increasingly out-of-date facial hair would have become something distinctive and noteworthy. I think that this almost certainly played a role in building up the specific cliche of kings with white mustaches, which was a pretty common look among kings during the last era when they were consistently in the news. The other explanation for the ubiquity of kingly facial hair would just be that most of us think of kings as men from an even more distant era, namely the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages was another one of those eras where beards were in fashion. I mean, this is a bit like the whole pointy crown thing, in that we don't really know if bearded kings were as common as artists in later eras would just decide they were. But in any case, as I said, this speculative artwork has had a lot of cultural influence just because of how often it is seen in textbooks and the like. And when it comes to building up stereotypes, on some level, it doesn't really matter whether a thing was actually common or not, as much as whether some critical mass of the public believes it to have been. So, that is all I have to say about kings. Longtime viewers will know I do not believe in monarchy as a political system, but at the same time, it is hard to deny that the image of the king, as this familiar stock character, is one of the oldest and most important characters in the entire Western cultural canon, and as we've hopefully seen today, one that provides us with a tangible link to quite a bit of important Western history as it relates to things like politics, religion, and class. Something to think about the next time you are playing a Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, at least. Can you think of another stock character you would like to see me deconstruct in agonizing detail? Let me know in the comments below, and I will see you next week.